Hello, I'm Sally Wiener Grotta, and I'm glad you could come tonight. This reading will be from my new novel called Women of a New Moon, which is in its first draft. Women of a New Moon is about a woman's Torah study group. We learn about the 6 modern women of the group, their personalities, histories, crises, and story arcs, through the filter of their monthly discussions of women of the Bible, such as Eve and Lilith, Sarah and Hagar, Miriam, Rebecca, and so forth. At the beginning of the book, they are what I call intimate strangers because they know each other only through frequent but superficial schmoozing at synagogue events. They meet once a month, taking turns hosting in their homes, and each chapter is from the host's point of view and her voice as she leads the group through that month, for that month. I'll read portions of chapter 2, in which Jen is leading a discussion of Sarah and Hagar. Here's some basics about the story, because we're coming in the middle. Well, not in the beginning. Jen, the point of view character for this chapter, is a 70-something retired journalist. Her only daughter, Irene, died of an opiate overdose about 10 years ago. Women of a New Moon is set in Black Bear, PA, the fictional Pocono Mountains village that is also the setting of my novel, JoJo. Just a few months ago, the small local synagogue, Beth Shalom, was torched by a neo-Nazi, and Rabbi David was killed in the fire. Rebecca is the rabbi's widow, and their infant daughter is Sophie. Dorothy is the Gentile second wife of a Jewish man. She was raised a Jehovah's Witness. So here's portions of chapter 2 of Women of a New Moon. I'm starting a few pages in from the beginning of chapter 2, by the way. Jen closed her eyes and took a grounding deep breath, filling her lungs with the warm fragrance of burning wood from the fireplace. Then opening her eyes, she referred to her narrow reporter's spiral-bound notebook, identical to the scores of pads she'd used for every assignment she'd ever undertaken. On the first line, she'd written, opening prayer, because she knew that was the proper form, but it felt personally dishonest and an insult to the other's faith to mouth words that didn't come from her heart. Instead, she improvised a variation on Rebecca's explanation of the blessing from the last session. Shall we begin engrossing ourselves in the words of the Torah to see what insights we might tease out of Sarah and Hagar's lives? Then she plowed ahead. I have to admit that I had difficulty preparing for this discussion. I was surprised by the stories about Sarah, Abraham, and Hagar. They're such familiar figures, but once I started reading, I realized I knew little about them. And frankly, that I don't particularly like them. Well, I don't like Sarah and Abraham. Hagar is something else. In many ways, she's the victim of the story, and maybe the only one truly blessed. Jen glanced down at her notes. Where should I begin? Rainbow started to speak, but then she shook her head, though Jen wasn't sure if she was trying to shake a thought loose or saying no to the act of speaking up. Even though therapy continued to help counter the physical effects of Rainbow's stroke, her language skills still lagged behind, as though she sometimes got lost somewhere between her mind and her ability to express herself. To be trapped inside your own body, to have so little control. Was that what it was like for Irene after her accident and the damn opiates took over? Jen forced herself to focus outward on the here and now, the minute details of the women's interactions around her. Chava touched Rainbow's shoulder, her tiny bejeweled hand moving with practiced grace. Take your time forming the words, dear. Do what Ed taught you in rehab. Take a deep breath and start over. Rainbow gulped some air and released it slowly through pursed lips. Then she tried again. Jen doesn't like Sarah and Abraham. That's wrong, isn't it? We're supposed to respect, wrong word. She paused and took another breath. Revere, yeah, revere them. They're our mother. And she swatted at the words as soon as they tumbled from her lips. No, they're our matriarch, patriarch. But Jen, she doesn't even like them. Rainbow looked to Rebecca, then Jen. Is that a sin? Rebecca didn't seem to hear the question. Instead, she stared blank-eyed toward the center of the braided rug, sighed deeply, then turned her attention to Sophie. Only then, when she reached into the carriage to touch her child, did her face brighten with a smile that reached her eyes. The corduroy of Jen's winter jeans as she uncrossed and recrossed her legs. She couldn't find a comfortable position. I don't know the rules of sin or anything regarding religious significance of these stories. To me, they're interesting tales that have formed the underpinnings of mythology and literature, religion and philosophy for many of the world's cultures. But they're more than that. The old sofa creaked when Alice shifted her weight. Sarah and Abraham, Eve and Adam, all the characters in the Bible are human beings like us. They fail sometimes. Failures and successes, doubts and questions. Without doubts or the very real potential of failure, how can a person make a moral choice? Dorothy grazed the side of her neck with her long, hot pink nails, unsettling the cowl of her form-fitting jersey. But they're God's chosen, the parents of us all, Christians and Jews, and Muslims, Alice added. No, not Sarah, pointing her index finger at Alice. Chava leaned forward, toppling the books and pad from her lap. She shook the first volume she picked up, her old worn Tanakh, each jab of that Bible's spine accenting the cadence of her words. Sarah had nothing to do with the Muslims. That was Hagar. Flipping her glasses from her head to her nose, she opened that old book and thumbed through the yellow pages, clearly looking for a specific passage to support her argument. Jen jumped in before Chava could preempt the discussion. So, if, as Alice suggests, this is a morality story, my mind goes directly to wondering about the underlying psychology. I think that many of the problems and issues stem from the fact that Sarah was barren. Chava looked up from her book. And married to a man who Hashem, the Eternal, has promised would be the father of a great nation. In other words, her value to the community is primarily as a breeder. Alice hooked loose strands of her tied back hair behind her ears. And she failed at that. Something in the way Dorothy said that, about failing as a breeder, as a mother, the husky downtone of her voice, made Jen wonder. As far as she knew, Dorothy had no children, other than Ned's from his previous marriage. But the clamped down emotions that filled the spaces between her words, she failed at that, echoed with a deeper hurt. I don't really know Dorothy at all. Jen glanced around the sitting area. But isn't that true about all of us? What does anyone know about another? Irene lived inside me for 9 months, slept against my heart, shared my soul, But from her first scream of indignation, she claimed her independence. And year by year, secrets thickened the wall, hers and mine. In the end, every one of us is alone and unknowable. Like Sarah and Hagar. Jen abandoned the sketchy outline in her notebook. I'm curious what it was like for Sarah and Hagar, mistress and servant, then sister wives. Sisters? Rainbow chewed on her long gray braid. Jen wondered if it was a nervous habit that predated her stroke, or was it her attempt to keep her mouth from spewing words unconnected to her brain? Jen's being metaphorical, dear, Chava said. They weren't really sisters. Sarah was Abraham's first and primary wife, but she was barren. Sorry, I had to skip a page. So she gave him her handmaiden Hagar to bed, some say to wed. The result was Abraham's firstborn Ishmael. Like that movie Handmaid's Tale, Dorothy added. Chava smiled. Exactly. Jen cringed and sighed, but managed to hide her distaste, or at least she hoped she did. Every time Chava opens her mouth to speak, I swear it's like fingernails on a chalkboard. Even her smiles are officious, self-satisfied. More comfortable with rational explanations than instinctive rancor, Jen quickly returned to the subject at hand. The point is that Sarah and Hagar lived in each other's pockets, first as mistress and servant, then as two wives of the same man. But they didn't really know one another. They saw each other as the symbols they become to the rest of us. Not human beings, but objects to be used or obstacles to be surmounted. Alice tugged at the hem of her oversized cable sweater as she leaned forward. At least that's the story told about Sarah and Hagar by the men who assembled the Torah. Some men can't conceive of women being partners and helpmates. Dorothy nodded, a full body motion that made her long earrings dance behind her blonde curls. I once met a man who was convinced that women, especially beautiful women, were natural rivals, that we couldn't possibly like each other. Sounds like a particularly stupid man, Chava sneered. Alice jumped in at the same time. If Sarah and Hagar were at each other's throats, it was because of their situation, powerless except through their association with Abraham. So they became rivals for his attention. I'm confused. Rainbow shaped her thoughts into words slowly. I thought Sarah, well, she was okay about, Hagar and Abraham. So why? I mean, at each other's throats? Everyone was quiet for a few breaths until they were sure Rainbow was finished. Then Alice stretched against the back of the sofa, her long, lean body filling the space of silence so clearly that the others waited for her to respond to Rainbow's question. Alice said, think of everything you've heard about harem politics. Sarah was the head wife, which meant she ruled the household. But her power reached only as far as the females in the tribe. Once Hagar went to Abraham's tent and then gave him a son, she had leverage. Can you imagine the cat fights for power that might unleash? Nothing's changed. Victims still beat down other victims. The image of the first ravaged South Vietnamese village Jen had seen flashed in her mind, and her stomach roiled from the smoky tendrils of burnt flesh that had seeped into her being. 2 years later, when given the choice to terminate an unexpected pregnancy from a weekend fling, Jen had chosen life, trading in the escapades of a globe-trotting foreign correspondent for a single mom's tiny Greenwich Village apartment. Now, here she was in the Poconos, as far from both as she could be, and surrounded by women rather than the men, fellow reporters, editors, subjects, publishers. who had dominated her career. You know, Jen's voice rasped, syllables catching on memories. Sarah and Hagar should have been natural allies, but Hagar, being the lowest on the totem pole, got the worst end of the stick. And the best. Alice's measured tone, so warm and reasonable, was in stark contrast to Jen's. Remember, God spoke directly to Hagar. She was the first person to name God. And like Abraham, God promised her that she'd be the mother of a great nation. Dorothy sighed so deeply that all eyes turned toward her. In a small voice, she asked, "Is the level of Hagar's tribulations at the hands of Sarah and Abraham in proportion to the blessings God planned for her?" "No, I refuse to accept that kind of thinking." Jen's indignation rose in her throat, a burning nausea. The idea that a person needs to suffer terribly in order to warrant blessings. Damn, what sort of God creates those kinds of sadomasochistic rules? How dare you? Chava spoke slowly, catapulting each syllable with unerring precision. God doesn't answer to you, to any of us. What do you think gives you? Why the hell not? Jen's words spewed from her of their own volition. Is God the only being in the universe who exists outside the standards of morality? Chava blanched. God is not a being. God is limitless and unfathomable. You can't shrink Hashem to your human dimensions to try to fit him into your aesthetic peg holes. Suddenly her voice became a low growl. Why are you even here? She held her Tanakh aloft. If this means nothing to you. Because I am a Jew, and we're the only people who have a religious obligation to question God, even argue with God, whether we believe in such a universal force or not. Thank you. And that's Women of a New Moon. And yes, they do get into some rather strong arguments. Then again, that's the rabbinic tradition, isn't it? This is probably the most challenging writing project I've ever undertaken, and it's proven to be quite an experience. I'm going to be writing periodic essays about my adventure as I study the stories of various women of the Bible, and then weave them into the stories of these 6 women, and of course, of the burnt, destroyed temple. I'll post these essays and perhaps other readings from the book on my website at sallywienergrotta.com. I hope you've enjoyed the reading. Hope I didn't shock too many people. And please visit my website. Let me know what you think about the essays and about the readings, about my book idea, or about anything. I'd be thrilled if you wanted to comment and discuss some of the difficult material I'm covering. Your perspective may prove to be the inspiration I need to keep going on this difficult project. Thank you once again for being here tonight, and I will look forward to reading your comments and hearing from you. Good night.